Hi boys and girls, my name is International Master Ben Finegold, and this is our video, Chess Tactics for Scholastic Chess Players. This is volume 1 of a 3-volume series, and this volume will concentrate on the opening. Our second volume will concentrate on the middle game. Our third volume, of course, will concentrate on the end game. Each volume will concentrate only on tactics. Those are the moves in chess where we win or lose material. And let's not forget about the losing material. I know a lot of you are anxious to win all of your opponent's pieces, and that's what I'm anxious to do when I'm playing in tournament chess. However, it's also important not to lose your own pieces. As you well know, your opponent, the person you're playing against, also has tactics, and they can take your pieces as well. So we're going to show both sides of the coin, and we're going to make sure when you have favorable tactics in your positions, you'll find them, and when your opponents have threats against you, you'll have good defense as well. We're going to show 14 positions in our first video, followed by my favorite game, which basically envelops every tactic that we've learned in this video. Our first position will be the most basic, and you've probably seen it before in many scholastic games. White puts his pawn on e4. You will notice the letters and number system, the algebraic chess notation system, which we use in all of our chess games. If you look on the bottom of the board and the top of the board, you will see letters. If you look on each side, you will see numbers. Looking up and down, we see the letter E, and looking side to side, we see the number 4. Therefore, this square is E4. And for those of you who played chess and have kept notation before, this will be quite familiar to you. Black plays E5. This position is by far the most common position in scholastic chess and in scholastic chess tournaments. I'm sure almost all of you watching this video who have played chess before have had this exact position. And now there's a move that's played very often in scholastic chess tournaments that is very rare at the grandmaster level. It's a very threatening tactical move. And black has good ways to meet it, but if you don't know how to meet this move, you could get in grave danger. The move is Queen H5. And if this move was played at the grandmaster level, then black would probably chuckle and laugh at such a dangerous, obviously bad move. However, at the local scholastic level, this move wins many chess games, and you have to know how to meet it or you'll get in a lot of trouble. First, think to yourself, Queen H5, what does this attack? Let's have a look. Well, most people right away are afraid of getting checkmated on F7, as this has happened in many scholastic chess games. We call this scholar's mate. And in this particular position, white is not threatening scholar's mate, because if white plays queen takes F7 next move, you will notice the queen has no protection. And so black could simply play king takes queen, and black would be ahead of queen. And this would be quite bad for white. So going back, we notice this move is not a threat. Some of my students believe this move is a threat. But as you can see, this pawn is well protected by black's rook. Therefore, why did white play Queen H5? What is he actually threatening? If we look for a little while, we can actually see the queen is threatening to take the E5 pawn. Queen takes E5 check. And black must do something about this. Unfortunately, in many, many, many scholastic games, black plays the unfortunate pawn to G6. Why does black play such an obviously bad move, not protecting his pawn? Well, there's two reasons. The first reason is black wasn't thinking properly. He wasn't thinking, what does this move attack, and then answer his own question. Instead, he was thinking, how can I attack this queen? And he found a way to do it. Unfortunately, now white's threat has become even stronger. Queen takes E5 check, and now we have one of my favorite tactics, and this tactic is called a fork. Not the kind that you eat with. This is the kind that you see in chess, where you attack two pieces at once. The queen attacks the king, which we already stated. What other piece is white attacking? If you said the pawn on C7, you better rewind the video and have a look again, because if queen takes C7, black can simply take the queen. Black doesn't want to, actually black does want white to do that. White doesn't want to do that. That would be a very bad move. However, because of the bad move G6, which black played previously, the diagonal to his rook is open. And once black escapes check, let's say with bishop E7, for example, blocking the check, white would be a full rook ahead. And I've seen this position many, many times in scholastic chess tournaments. and that is because black was not paying attention to white's threat. Let's go back to the original position. And now we know white is threatening queen takes pawn check, and we have to do something about it. Well, there's two obvious moves black can play to defend his pawn. Do you see what they are? If you said pawn to f6, you are sadly mistaken. This move is illegal because the pawn is pinned. Pin, spelled P-I-N, is another tactic that we'll be discussing later. Now, black's king would be in check. In many scholastic events, I've seen similar positions, and white plays queen takes king and says, I win. But that's not how we win at chess. We win at chess by checkmating our opponent. And this move is an illegal move. It's not allowed. Black must take his move back. Black is not allowed to move into check. Instead, black must find a legal way to protect his pawn. The two best ways to do so, which I'm sure you've already found, are the simple developing move, knight c6, defending the pawn, or pawn to d6, and the pawn defends the pawn. And now black has a very safe game. Many players will also defend their pawn by moving out their queen, either to e7 or to f6. However, as already stated, moving the queen out right away isn't very good strategy, and grandmasters would never do such a thing. So for black to counter this queen move with a queen move of his own would mean both players have equally badly made a mistake, and we don't want that to happen. So if I were black, I would play knight c6, developing my knight and protecting my pawn. There are players I know who would play d6, and now their bishop has more scope. Either way, black protects his pawn and sees this tactic. What is the name of this tactic? This is the simplest tactic in chess. It's called a direct threat. Very few tactical books talk about direct threats. They talk about more complicated tactics, which were also in this position. The first one was a fork, where the queen attacks the king and the rook. And the second tactic was the pin. This pawn cannot move because it's pinned, and so f6 would not be allowed. Black would be in check. Forks and pins are two of the most important tactics you can utilize in your own chess games. However, in this position, the very simple tactic of a direct threat can easily be parried by black, and you should never try to make such a move. If your opponent cannot see a direct threat in many positions, you should win in any case. However, if you have the black pieces, you want to be able to defend against these direct threats. Direct threats are the simplest tactics there are. They are just moves made by one side with simple threats to your pieces. And those are the tactics that you should see the most, the direct threats. That was position one of our video. What do we learn from this position? Number one, find out all of your opponent's tactical threats. And number two, watch out for aggressive queen moves. Those can be killers. Now, let's get to position two. This time we actually go 3 moves deep. The same opening, e4, e5. And now, white plays a similarly aggressive move, bishop to c4, with a very nice diagonal it's on, bearing down on the pawn next to black's king, called the f7 pawn. Many chess teachers call this pawn the weak point, or the weak square. Why do we call it that? Well, let's go back and find out. In this position, you will notice each pawn on both sides of the board is protected. However, there are 3 pawns next to each king. For black, it's d7, e7, and f7. And for white, it's d2, e2, and f2. And in these positions, the starting position of chess, the 2 pawns in front of the king and queen are defended 4 times each. That's right, 4 times. The king protects this pawn, the queen protects this pawn, the bishop does, and the knight does. On this pawn, in front of the queen, we still have the king, the queen, the other bishop, and the other knight protecting this pawn. Those are not weak points. If black ever attempts to do some kind of sabotage on these squares, he will be in a lot of trouble. And so therefore, when you try to checkmate and play brilliant tactics against your opponent, normally we go for these weak points, f2 and f7. If you analyze the f2 and f7 squares in your head and ask yourself, now how many times are those squares protected? You say, wait a minute, this isn't protecting the pawn, this isn't, only the king is. That's why these are weak points. So after the opening moves, e4, e5, white immediately goes for the kill, bishop c4. Black develops his knight. Seems like a reasonable move. And now, white plays for what we call scholar's mate. And we saw a little example of that in the previous position. And the difference here is, not only is the queen attacking f7, but the bishop is as well. And when a bishop and a queen work together, we call that a battery. And if you can line up batteries against your opponent and they have insufficient defense, sometimes you can win the game quickly. In this position, it is of the utmost importance black sees this checkmate. Many players do not know this checkmate and make a simple developing move. And white plays queen takes f7 mate. And this, boys and girls, is scholar's mate. Many, many scholastic games will end this way because one side knows the scholar's mate, whereas the other side doesn't know it and cannot figure it out. At the moment, those of you watching the video belong to the first group. Now you know scholar's mate. Not only can you do scholar's mate with white, of course, black can also try scholar's mate. For example, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, queen f6. And black is threatening the same checkmate that white was threatening on f7. And again, if white doesn't see this checkmate and plays the simple d3, then black will checkmate white. And this is the kind of tactic you never want to fall into. When you're playing in a scholastic chess tournament with 50, 100, or even a nationals with thousands of children, do you want to be the first person to lose? I didn't think so. So knowing the scholar's mate is very important. Now, am I recommending you play scholar's mate each game? Certainly not. As a chess teacher, I never teach my pupils to do scholar's mate. That only teaches you one thing, and when your opponent avoids scholar's mate, let's say with knight f3, blocking the queen, now the queen is in a very silly position, and later white will play knight d5 and attack the queen and force him back. Scholar's mate is good to know so that you don't fall into it. Many chess tactics are good to know so you can surprise your opponent. However, they are also good to know so you can avoid them. That was the end of position 2. What did we learn from that position? That was much more exciting. We learned number 1, f7, and sometimes f2 if you have the white pieces, are weak squares. Those are squares you can get checkmated on in the opening if you have not castled. We learned what scholar's mate was. That's where white plays e4 on his first move, bishop c4 on move 2, queen f3 on move 3, and queen takes f7 checkmate on move 4, the 4-move checkmate. Notice how the queen and the bishop made a battery. The battery is a very important point in learning tactics in the openings. Scholar's mate is something you never want to fall into, and you never will. Now there's a third position in our video which also features scholar's mate. However, instead of playing queen f3 as in example number 2, white plays queen h5. Again, very ominous, and queen takes f7 is the threat. In example 2, when white threatened queen takes f7 mate, black's best move clearly is knight f6, developing his knight off the back row to a nice center square, blocking white's queen. However, in this position, if white tries the other scholar's mate, knight f6 is insufficient to block the queen, and the queen simply moves diagonally and gives checkmate. Notice, black cannot play king takes queen because the bishop on c4 protects the queen. Do you remember what that was called? Very good. That was called a battery. The queen and the bishop are lined up protecting each other. If the bishop was not yet developed, black could simply play king takes queen, and white would be down a queen. Not very good. Let's go back to example 3. What should black do against the threatened mate? If you were black, what would you do? Have a look. Did you make the same move I would make? In this position, there are 4 moves that reasonably stop checkmate. The queen can protect from e7 or from f6. The pawn can block the queen with g6. Or the knight can protect the mate with knight h6. I'm not a fan of knight h6 because knight h6 is on the side. Knight on the rim is better for him. We don't want our knight on the side of the board. Also, I don't like moving my queen out early in the game, as I've said in previous examples. Therefore, did you choose the same move that I did? I chose g6, attacking the queen. And now, in example 1, white played the move queen takes pawn check and won the rook. However, in example 3, which is on your screen right now, this would be quite bad for white. Do you see why? Very good. After queen takes pawn, check, black plays the crushing move, knight takes queen. Again, these are direct threat tactics. White has a threat on f7, black stops it, and the queen must move away. Again, white could play for scholar's mate with queen f3, once again renewing the mate threat, and black has many ways to stop it. I would choose knight f6, and you could also protect with your queen. As long as you see the threatened mate, you'll be able to defend against it. If you don't see the checkmate, you'll lose many chess games in just a few moves. What square do we get checkmated on? Well, when you're black, f7. That's the weak point. If you're white, it would be f2. These tactics are very important to know. They're called scholar's mate and the attack on the weak point. In positions where neither side has castled, these are the squares you have to pay the most attention to. And these are very dangerous points. And when you see your opponent move his queen out very early in the game, normally you can take advantage of these queen moves by attacking your opponent's queen relentlessly, eventually maybe even winning his queen. However, the queen itself may have very important threats, difficult threats to stop, and we have to prevent these threats. Otherwise, we can lose games quickly. Now you just saw position 3. Position 3 was very similar to position 2, with the slight exception on move 3, white played queen h5, also threatening scholar's mate with queen takes f7 checkmate. Those are the two types of scholar's mate, and now you know both of them, and you know how to avoid them. Now, on to position 4. Position 4 is yet another checkmate with a twist. This twist is called a pin, and a twisted pin can be painful indeed. Black plays c6, very unusual at the scholastic level, but many world champions, including Anatoly Karpov, have played the move c6, and we call this the Caro-Kann defense. White plays d4, and now black shows the reasoning behind his move, d5. Now his c6 pawn protects d5, and black has a solid center. Now, here's a very good example of a direct threat tactic. What is black threatening in this position? Do you see it? I think you do. That's correct. Pawn takes pawn, or d takes e4. White has many moves to choose from, and it's a good idea if you play the Caro-Kann with the black pieces to be prepared against the advanced Caro-Kann, e5, or for white protecting his pawn, knight c3 or knight d2, or white can simply trade pawns, e takes d5, c takes d5. These are all very popular continuations for white. Well, we'll concentrate on the one that's most tactical, knight c3, protecting the pawn. Black plays d takes e4. White recaptures on e4. And now, once again, black has a wide variety of choice. One of the most popular moves today is knight to d7. Why would black play a move like knight to d7? This move blocks the queen and blocks the bishop. Well, this is what we call a preparatory move. Black is preparing. What is he preparing? He's preparing to play knight f6. Why not play knight f6 right now? Do you see what white should do? Well, white has many moves. However, the best move is knight takes knight. Knight takes f6 check. Whichever way black recaptures, he will have a somewhat messed up pawn structure. Here he has a weak pawn, doubled pawns, and here he has what we call a false majority. There's 4 pawns over here, and white only has 3, but these 4 pawns aren't really better than these 3 pawns. They can't really get any strength. On the queen's side, white has 4 pawns, and black has 3, but white's 4 pawns are obviously better than black's 3. Eventually, white might get a queen in the endgame, although this would be very far down the road. Some grandmasters will play knight f6 in any case, but most grandmasters will prepare knight f6 with knight d7. What is the idea? Well, when we play knight f6, if white takes the knight, which way do you think black will recapture? That's right, he's going to take back with his knight. And that's why he played knight to d7. Now, there are some tricksters out there who try to stop knight f6. At the grandmaster level, grandmasters play one of 4 different moves. Knight f3, a simple developing move. Bishop d3, also developing. Bishop c4, and the very, very aggressive knight g5. Now, knight g5 was invented about 15 years ago and has caught many grandmasters in some subtle traps. Let's look at one right now before we go back to our position. In this position, this looks quite silly. Black could simply play h6 attacking the knight. Why did he move his knight again? We can't play chess like that. Knight c3, knight takes e4, knight g5. This isn't a Knights Tour video, this is a tactics video. Why is white making all knight moves? Because he's playing for tricks. At the grandmaster level, tricks usually don't work, but in this position, white has the brilliant shot knight to e6, which the grandmaster with black did not see. What is the idea? Well, we're attacking the queen, of course. If black takes the free knight, then white has the brutally strong move, which you saw in position 1 and position 3. Queen h5 check. The king is trapped. Black has one move, g6, and white takes with checkmate. An ominous finish. However, grandmasters would never fall into such nonsense. They would never play pawn takes knight. And so the grandmaster with the black pieces, not wanting to get checkmated, played queen a5 check. Okay, so this gets the queen out of attack. Now it looks like white is in trouble because not only is he in check, but his knight is attacked. What can white do to save himself? He only has one good move. Did you find it? It's bishop to d2. Not only does this prevent check, it attacks the black queen. Black moves his queen out of harm's way. And now, black fully expected white to play knight takes bishop. Otherwise, he would simply lose his knight. However, white did not see a reason yet to move his knight and played the great developing move, bishop to d3. Black was puzzled by this move and played the blunder, f takes e6. When a good player plays a very bad move, we call that a blunder. And that's exactly what black did in this position. White played queen h5 check. Black played king d8. And now it looks like white simply is a piece behind. However, with the king and the queen lined up on the diagonal, white has a beautiful trick. Can you find it? It's very difficult. That's right, and this is one of our examples of which tactic? This is the example of a pin, bishop to a5. And now the bishop is pinning the queen to the king, whereas white's queen is protecting his bishop. And now black will lose his queen. Now we actually see the genius of white's bishop to d3. In this position, when black was in check, what if black had played g6 first? Should white capture with the queen or with the bishop? Let's analyze both. If he captures with the queen, now bishop a5 is no longer available. The queen on h5 does not protect the bishop. The queen has been driven off. That is why the grandmaster with the white pieces played bishop to d3. He wanted to take with the bishop on g6, leaving his queen to protect a5 in the eventuality king d8, bishop a5, winning black's queen. So even simple tactics can befell a great grandmaster, and many times they have. Therefore, today, grandmasters no longer play h6 against the cunning knight to g5, and black has found other ways to get a reasonable position. Now, even more dangerous than knight to g5 is the insidious queen e2. Another one of those queen moves. Normally, queen moves in the opening are quite bad. You can't move your queen every move. You have to get out your minor pieces. Here, if we go back, why did black play knight d7? Well, he wanted to play knight g to f6, and the knights are protecting each other. The only purpose of queen e2 is to prevent knight f6. Why does it prevent knight f6? Many players find out the hard way. They play knight f6, not seeing white's threat, and now to shock and amaze you, white has checkmate in one move. That's right, checkmate in one move. And many people assume it's knight takes knight check. Of course, that can't possibly be it. Now knight takes knight. And this is the reason black played knight to d7. However, we see the queen on e2 lined up against the black king. That's always very dangerous. There's only one other move in this position that is check. Do you see it? Yep, it's knight to d6, checkmate. The king has nowhere to go. The pawn cannot capture the knight because he would be in check. And that, boys and girls, is checkmate. And that's tactic number 4. And this is called a pin. At the moment, none of black's pieces are pinned. But once we play knight to d6, all of a sudden the white queen is unleashed. And now we see why the queen is the most powerful piece, pinning the black pawn to the king. What should white have done instead? I'm sorry, what should black have done instead? Black has to defend d6 with the cunning move e6. And now the black bishop has its say. The bishop protects d6, and on the following move, black can safely play knight f6. And white will wonder, why did I put my queen here in front of my bishop? So tactic number 4 is threatening knight to d6 mate. If black doesn't see it, and if you have the black pieces, you will be in a lot of trouble. As long as you see your opponent's threats and these pinning tactics, you'll win more chess games. And that was position 4, a very important segment in the video which taught you about pins. If you understand the mastery of pins, you too can win lots of games quickly. Now, let's get to position 5. Now, along with position number 4, with this knight to d6 checkmate, reminds me of another position from the Budapest Gambit. And in the Budapest Gambit, black sacrifices a pawn as early as move 2 with the move e5. Grandmasters generally don't play e5 because they don't like losing their pawns. However, let's look at a nice tactic and see how black can checkmate white quite early if white's not paying attention. Knight to g4, attacking the pawn. Knight f3, defending his pawn. Knight c6. Bishop f4. And in fact, white's 2 moves could have been reversed. White could have played bishop f4 previously and then played knight f3, and we would get to the same position. Now, black plays bishop b4 check. White's probably not going to defend with his bishop because then he would have insufficient defense of his pawn. So he could simply block the check with his knight. And now, how can black attack this pawn once again? Well, just like with the previous tactics, it's with a queen move. Queen e7. And now, it is impossible for white to defend his pawn. The bishop is on a white square, obviously can't defend a pawn on a dark square, and the queen can't get over there to defend, so white does a counterattack, attacking black's bishop. What's more important, the bishop or the pawn? Obviously, a bishop is worth more than a pawn. However, in this position, black may have other threats. Black takes the pawn. A friend of mine, who's a chess master, has had this position many times with black. And about half the time, his opponents overlook the threat and simply take his bishop. If you're playing a master player and you think he's given away a bishop for absolutely nothing, think twice. Masters don't like giving their pieces away, and usually there's a trick involved. Do you see the trick here? It's just like the position we looked at where white gave checkmate. This is very similar. Queen and a king on the same file. And that's right, it's the same checkmate. Knight to d3, checkmate. This time, black is checkmating white. An unfortunate finish for white, who wasn't watching black's threats, but was greedy and took that free bishop. Not as free as he thought. And you too can checkmate your opponent if you learn the power of pins. Notice how the pawn can't capture the knight because it's pinned to the king. One of my favorite tactics in chess is to have my queen and my opponent's king on the same file. In this case, the E file. Why is the E file so popular? Well, when the game of chess starts, your king is on the E file. Both kings are. So if you have white or black and you get your queen on the E file early in the game, sometimes dangerous tactics can emerge. So far in our video, we've learned about many different tactics. Let's take a break for a minute and see what they are. Number 1, we learned about forks. Number 2, pins. Number 3, developing your minor pieces, bishops and knights. And number 4, watching out for the opponent's threats. If you continue to do this in all of your chess games, you too will be a successful chess player. One of our new ideas will not be checkmate, but the simple winning of material. What is material? Well, if you win your opponent's rook, and you win your opponent's knight, and you win your opponent's bishop, you say, I won material. This is free material. And normally, the more pieces you capture, the better chance you'll have to win the game. Imagine a game of football, for example, where one side has 11 players and the other side has 4 players. I know which side to bet on. Here, white has 16 men and black only has 13. Okay, so black needs to get some of his pieces back. Otherwise, they'll say I'm cheating. We don't want that to happen. So in this position, we're going to have the same opening moves, e4, e5, as we did previously. And now, white's going to play the nice developing move, knight f3. What tactic is this? This is the tactic of direct threat. The knight is attacking the pawn. Black protects the pawn. And now, white plays the simple and passive move, bishop e2. Grandmasters would never play such a move because the bishop has more aggressive squares to go to. But for our example, we can see how, even against passive play, black can lose material. Knight f6, another direct threat, attacking the pawn. Pawn to d3. Bishop c5. White castles. Black plays d6, and white plays pawn to c3. And now, there are many good moves for black, for example, castles, but there's one very bad move for black that, unfortunately, I've seen all too often at the scholastic level, and that move is bishop to e6. And if a grandmaster made this move, we would say that's a blunder. However, at the scholastic level, a lot of scholastic players get all of their pieces out. However, this walks into a 2-move tactic, and we call this a fork. Notice how black is setting his pieces up to get forked. Bishop and knight on the same color. And in this case, if you were white, if you could imagine, what piece would you want to put here to fork these 2 pieces? A queen, a bishop, a knight, a rook, or a pawn? Well, obviously not a queen, because you would simply lose your queen. A rook getting there wouldn't attack either piece. A knight there also wouldn't attack either piece. If a bishop got there somehow, we wouldn't be worried at all, because that would simply be a trade of pieces. However, one of the key themes of tactics is to attack big pieces with little pieces. That is why when you move your queen out very early in the game, and your opponent captures your queen, and you capture whatever piece it is they captured your queen with, that's not good. And you don't want to lose your queen for any other piece. Here, the bishop and the knight, although they're very small pieces, they're not as small as, that's right, the pawn. And this pawn can work its way up to d5 by simply first playing d4, attacking the bishop. Black can trade pawns or retreat his bishop. If he trades pawns, white will take back with his pawn. Notice how white has d4 sufficiently protected. He has a queen on d1 and a knight on f3, and black has 2 pieces attacking the pawn also. So if black simply takes the pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, bishop takes, queen takes, white will be a piece ahead in this case as well. If black retreats, finally, white gets to play his fork, and black will end up losing one of his pieces. If only black had seen this coming and not played bishop to e6, this would not be very dangerous at all. After d4, d5, only one piece is attacked, and black's knight has many squares to retreat to. However, if black doesn't pay attention to white's threats and makes simple developing moves, sometimes he walks into a fork. In chess, as well as in real life, you never want to walk into a fork. Okay, so in this position, bishop and knight on the same color getting forked by a pawn. When your pieces are on the same color, it's very common a pawn or a knight or a bishop will fork these pieces. After that, we can see it's important not only to find your own tactics, but to watch out for the opponent's threats and tactics and tricks, especially pins. Don't fall into any pins now. Now, let's get to the next position. There are three pieces that always attack the same color. Those pieces are the bishop, the knight, and the pawn. Let's put a knight in the center of the board. Did you ever notice that knights only go to one color? This knight's on a white square. Each square it can go to is black, or in this case, green. If we put a bishop on the same square, it's on a white square, it only goes to white squares. If we put a pawn on d5, it only attacks white squares. Certain pieces, the bishop, knight, and the pawn, only attack one color. If your pieces are all on one color, they can get forked. If, for example, in the starting position, the king and the queen are on different colors, as is the case, it's not possible for a bishop, a knight, or a pawn to attack both at the same time. We have to sort of help our opponent out and make them move their pieces to the same color so we can encourage them to let us fork their pieces. Forking your opponent's pieces, attacking 2 or 3 of them at the same time, is one of the best ways to win material. And now we learn something else. Not just checkmating your opponent, which ends the game. There are other ways to win at chess also. In chess tactics, sometimes the goal is not checkmate, it's to win material and free pieces, which we saw in the last position. The more pieces you capture, the better your chances of winning. So take those free pieces. This is one of our more complicated examples. It comes from a very bad opening called the England Gambit. You've probably never heard of this opening because it's not played at the Grandmaster level. White plays d4 on the first move, which we saw in the Budapest Gambit in the previous example. And black plays the awful move e5, losing a pawn to direct attack. How could black make such an obviously bad move? That's because black is playing for tricks. And if you don't know these tricks, you can also lose quickly. Knight c6, attacking the e5 pawn. White sees that, plays knight f3. And now, if black wants to attack the pawn again, he has to play queen e7. And unfortunately, there are many ways for white to go wrong here. Probably the best move for white is to simply ignore the pawn and just do quick development. Knight c3, followed by knight d5, attacking the queen. However, those greedy players who want to hang on to their extra material will play bishop to f4. And bishop f4 is not a bad move, but it creates a myriad of complications for which anybody can go wrong. And now, black has a great move in this position which forks 3 of white's pieces, which we actually haven't seen yet in previous examples. Can you find this move? If you look at our previous examples, you'll remember when the queen moves out for either side, that's the piece that's making all the threats. And of course, this is no exception. Queen b4 check. What are we attacking now? Well, of course we're attacking the king, but we're also attacking the bishop on f4 and the pawn on b2. And this is very annoying for white. Of course, white must get out of check. Of course, white can't lose his bishop. White already has an extra pawn, so he can afford to give back one of the pawns of his own. What should white do? White has 2 ways to save his bishop. Unfortunately, it's necessary in this position to look very far ahead to see which move is better. If you're not willing to put the time into chess to look far ahead, you'll lose many games quickly. In this position, which 2 moves can white play to save his bishop? Did you find them? Bishop d2 is one move. The other move is queen to d2. Which move do you think is better? If you said queen to d2, unfortunately, you're mistaken. And now we will see how white gets punished. Queen takes b2. I hope you saw that move, attacking your rook. What did you plan to do about that? Well, there's only one way to save your rook, queen to c3. And now this walks into a very nasty pin, which we saw in a previous example, except now black gets to pin white. Bishop b4, and white has to say bye-bye to his queen, and usually that's bye-bye to the game. Let's say that white can see that far ahead, and instead plays the proper move, bishop to d2. And of course, black takes on b2. Once again, there are 2 reasonable moves to defend this rook. However, one of them is good move and one of them loses. Which one would you play? Well, we can play bishop to c3, defending our rook, attacking the queen. Or we can play knight c3, and the queen defends the rook this way. Well, it should be clear to a very strong chess player that developing pieces is a good idea, whereas making lots and lots and lots of bishop moves is probably not right. It turns out in this position that is correct. After bishop c3, black wins in much the same way he won in the previous example. He plays bishop to b4, just like when white's queen was there. And now white has two moves. He can capture the bishop, or he can protect his bishop. Unfortunately for white, he cannot capture the queen because of one of our favorite tactics, the pin. White would be in check. Let's look at both of these moves. Bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, and we have a very annoying attack on c2 and a very annoying attack on a1. White is helpless. He cannot stop either threat. And, well, of course, defending your rook is more important than defending a pawn. However, if we want to defend our rook, we'll have to move our knight. So the queen defends the rook, let's say to d2. But after knight takes c2 check, not only is our rook lost, but even more importantly, white's queen is lost. White must sacrifice his queen to escape check. Luckily for you at home, we have an even more brilliant variation. And this is my favorite one, and I have to say, I was able to accomplish this feat many times. After bishop c3, bishop b4, the other move for white is queen to d2. This loses in spectacular fashion. And I think I've had the black pieces in blitz games many times in this position. In a slow tournament, I would never play in such a haphazard way. However, in blitz chess, we can get away with more. Bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, defending the rook, and now black has checkmate in one move. Can you find it? I knew you could. Queen c1 mate. About a year ago, I gave a lecture on this opening and showed this final position. Later that evening, in a blitz tournament where each side has 5 minutes, I was able to get this position with black. So actually practicing what I preach. Now if we go back to the position after queen takes b2, what did I recommend white should do in this position? Do you remember? Yes, knight c3. Developing a piece. And now black should get punished for making all of these queen moves. Later, white will play rook b1, and the queen will move more and more and more, and white will have a nice lead in development. In this position, theory thinks that white has a slight advantage. So the position after queen b4 check is tricky indeed, and there are many tactics involved. There's forks, and later on, with the bishop coming to b4, there were many pins. Forks and pins are the two most common tactics in chess. Not only do you have forks, but you also have direct attack, as in this position. That was an important lesson. We learned about forking pieces on the same color. If your opponent has all their pieces on white or all their pieces on the dark colors, they're set up to be forked by your pieces. Remember, your knights, your bishops, and your pawns can only attack pieces on one color. So watch out for that and don't fall into forks yourself. Now that you've learned that, let's go to the next position. This one actually has a name. It's called Legal's mate. We start out with our favorite, e4, e5, knight f3. Black can play Philidor's defense, d6. Quite unusual today at the top level, but still a playable move. Bishop c4. And now, a lot of scholastic players play too passively. And in this position, one of their moves would be h6, preventing white from ever playing knight g5. This move is passive, though, and doesn't help black develop his minor pieces. White, of course, continues development. And now, black, having watched our video probably, plays bishop g4, because this pins the knight, and pinning is good. However, the new vocabulary word for this lesson will be pseudo-pin, because this is not actually a pin. In fact, this sets black up to get in a lot of trouble. Why is black getting in trouble? Well, too many pawn moves. While white is quickly getting his pieces out to the center, black is just making pawn moves. And now that black has only one piece developed, white has a beautiful trick that will win material. Can you find this beautiful trick white has? Well, one trick white can play, which doesn't work in this position, is bishop takes pawn check, king takes bishop, and now knight takes e5 check, and the queen is attacking the bishop. However, in order to win black's bishop on g4, white had to give up two of his own pieces. The bishop was sacrificed and the knight was sacrificed. So if we count the material, we'll see that black has 3 minor pieces and white only has 2. That didn't work out very well. In other positions, that tactic will work. But with the great defense that black has of his e5 pawn, it is not quite sufficient in this position. However, white has another tactic, and one of the things I teach many of my chess students, if you see a tactic and it doesn't quite work, look at the first 2 moves in reverse order. That's right, reverse the first 2 moves. What were the first 2 moves in this position that we've just analyzed? Bishop takes pawn check and knight takes e5 check, which didn't quite work. If we reverse those moves and play knight takes e5 first, you will notice black has 2 moves. Bishop takes d1 or pawn takes knight. D takes e5 or pawn takes knight is simply met by queen takes g4. White sacrificed his knight. In return, he won black's bishop, but he also won a center pawn. Knight takes e5. So in this position, we have an equal number of minor pieces, 3 against 3, but white still has all of his pawns left. White has an extra pawn. Not only does white have an extra pawn, white has 3 pieces developed to 0. Not a good sign for black. However, most of you were probably afraid to take this pawn because you would lose your queen. And now we get to play the famous Legal's mate. Bishop takes f7 check. King has to go to e7. And now, do you see the checkmate white has? That's right. It's knight d5 mate. And the 3 white pieces put a beat down on black's king. Black is crushed because he didn't develop all of his pieces and he mainly made pawn moves, whereas white has total domination of the center. Let's go back and see that again. That was pretty nice. In this position, with white having a dominating lead in development, he simply plays knight takes pawn, and his pieces are prepared to give checkmate. A very nice checkmate. And that, boys and girls, is Legal's mate. Boy, that was terrible for black. What did he do wrong? Well, he made a lot of pawn moves in the opening. Did he move a lot of minor pieces? No, and that's why he got punished. White moved all of his minor pieces, and black only moved 1, and black got checkmated in the middle of the board. Legal's mate chose the proper punishment for someone who makes too many pawn moves in the opening and doesn't get their minor pieces developed. Now let's go to the next tactic. And now, we're going to go on a different tack, and we're going to show you one of my games. Now, normally when I lecture, I only show games that I win, so my students are proud of me. However, this was such a nice tactic, I'm going to go off the deep end and show you a game that I lost. My opponent was Grandmaster Igor Novikov, and Novikov currently lives in New York City. So originally from Russia and moved to the United States, and now he's one of the 3 highest rated players in the United States. How did he get so good? Was it from beating me? Let's find out. I was black, and we played a Queen's Gambit. No, white doesn't give up his queen. It's just called the Queen's Gambit because he's gambiting a pawn on the queen's side. I didn't take this pawn. I developed my knight. This is called Chigorin's defense. White developed his knight, and I played bishop to g4. This position, white has many moves. Novikov played the Alyekin variation, queen a4. And again, this is one of our wonderful tactics called a pin. The queen is pinning the knight to the black king. If white could move again, white would play knight e5, taking advantage of this pin. And now, black cannot capture the knight, because he would be in check. And the white knight is now attacking the black bishop. A very ominous move. So I took this knight. White recaptured with the g pawn. And I took this pawn. Now, my queen is attacking his d pawn. He protected his pawn, and now he's ready to recapture the pawn that I'm ahead. I attacked in the center. He took my pawn, and now I played queen to d5. This game was very tactical. This pawn is attacked, this pawn is attacked, and this pawn is attacked from my point of view. And I was sure white would play a move such as bishop e2, protecting his pawn, or bishop g2, or white would simply take on c4. However, white did none of those things. White developed his knight, an excellent move, developing a piece off the back row and attacking my queen. Here, I should take the center pawn, but I got greedy. I took the pawn on f3, attacking his rook. He moved his rook away. And now I made one of the worst blunders of my chess career. Even the best players make mistakes, but we learn from our mistakes, and we try not to do them over and over again. And I castled queenside. Castling queenside is usually riskier than castling kingside, especially when you have the black pieces, especially when you're not fully developed. And in this position, I calculated only the move bishop to g2, attacking my queen, and I was going to play queen g4, pinning the bishop to his rook. So if his bishop moves away, I could play queen takes rook check. Although today, I don't really trust my calculation on bishop g2, and bishop g2 is a reasonable move. However, my opponent found a way to win immediately, which I had overlooked. I spent so much of my time looking at bishop g2, I forgot to look at the other obvious way to attack my queen, which is bishop e2. And now, a horrible realization came to me. My queen cannot retreat to these squares because of his knight. I can't retreat this way because of his bishop. I only have two safe squares left, queen f5, queen h3. Unfortunately, these moves lose for the same reason. Because of my unfortunate castling queenside, my king is on this open diagonal, and if I put my queen on said diagonal, bishop g4 will win my queen. After bishop e2, the best black can do is get a rook for his queen. He can play knight takes pawn, protecting his queen. Bishop takes queen, knight takes check, forking the king and rook. King protects the rook, and we trade on g1. And if we count the material, you'll see that each side has a rook, bishop, and knight. However, for my rook, white has a queen, and a queen is much more powerful than a rook. And against a strong grandmaster like Novikov, I decided to simply resign and live to fight another day. So losing my queen on move 10, not my proudest moment, but a good tactical exercise for my students and a learning experience for everyone. Learning from your losses is what makes you a better player. The only way to avoid losing at chess is to not play at all. And I'm not willing to go that far. Sometimes you have to lose so you can become a better player. And overlooking tactics like bishop e2 and having your king and queen dangerously placed is a good lesson for the future. That may have been our most important position in the whole video. What happened? I lost in 10 moves, but the reason it was an important segment was I learned from my loss and I was not upset about it. I tried to find out why I lost and what I could do to play better next time. What did I do wrong? Well, I didn't calculate accurately and I castled queenside. Castling queenside without developing your pieces is very risky. I did not understand the risks at the time and I got punished. Learning from your losses is a great example of how top chess players get even better. Now, let's stop looking at my losses and get to some other tactics. Let's go to our next position. Our next position is from an opening that I used to play, and a friend of mine, who's also a master, played this opening as well, and he had the chance to play Nimzovich's defense. Aaron Nimzovich was a great chess player in the early 1900s, and he has many openings named after him. This is probably his least popular opening, but the one that has a lot of tactics involved. After d4, d5, white has three logical moves, e5, e takes d5, and knight c3. When I used to play this opening with black, I faced all of those moves. In this game, we're going to look at e5, where white gets an advance and tries to put more space in his position and prevent black from moving to the critical d6 and f6 squares. The knight will never go here, and the black bishop will never be able to go here to d6. This is a very cramping move, very hard for black to develop. Well, of course, if we play e6 right away, you will notice the bishop is very badly placed behind all of his pawns. So, the theoretical move, recommended by every chess book, is bishop to f5. And now we have a nice bishop. And in this position, most books recommend knight f3, simply developing a piece. However, a bad move, a bad tactical move, would be bishop to d3, which is just what white played in the game we're going to look at right now. Here, we're attacking black's bishop. Simple enough, direct attack. Normally, black would defend his bishop, let's say queen d7, retreat his bishop, bishop g6, or simply trade. However, we have a tactic here which not only wins material, but it protects our bishop. Can you see it? Yes, it's knight takes d4. The knight protects the bishop, and we've taken a free center pawn. Now in this position, my friend and I assumed black was simply a safe pawn ahead. But there's always tactics in chess, and you always have to be on the lookout. In this position, white tried bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, and now the very cunning move, queen to d3. What is the queen attacking? Yes, it's attacking the knight on f5. And you may say to yourself, well, that's easy enough to protect. I can play e6, I can play g6, I can move my knight away, I could protect my knight this way. I have many ways to protect my knight. Why is that a big deal? Well, not only is white threatening queen takes knight, white also has another threat with his queen. White's threatening to fork two of black's pieces. Do you see that move as well? Ah, this move is much more difficult to see. White is threatening queen b5 check, attacking the b7 pawn. So if black is only paying attention to his knight on f5, he will overlook queen b5 check and queen takes b7, and the hard-fought extra pawn he fought so hard for will be for naught. How can black stop queen b5 check and protect his knight at the same time? And this is actually quite simple to do. Queen d7. And in this position, we can neither play queen takes knight nor queen b5 check. This was played by my friend in the said game, and he won the game. Black has an extra pawn, and it's a center pawn to boot. If you're going to lose a pawn, I recommend it being a side pawn. Then at least you have an active rook, and you'll have a nice center. Here, white's center has crumbled, his d-pawn is gone, and he has no compensation for his pawn. That tactic didn't seem very important, but it was. Even losing one pawn can cause disaster, especially a center pawn. What have we learned from this? Keep your advanced center pawns protected. Don't let them fly away, and with it, your chess position. Now, let's go to the next position. And now to our next position, and the last one with the double king pawn, where we do e4, e5. And in this position, after the normal knight f3, knight c6, white has many moves. One popular move, especially at the scholastic level, is bishop c4. Now a rather old move called the Hungarian defense is bishop e7. Why does black play bishop e7? Well, a lot of people want to play knight f6, but they just don't know what to do against knight g5, attacking the f7 pawn. So in preparation for that, black plays bishop e7. Assuming white makes a neutral move, black will then play knight f6, and he's already ready to castle. After bishop e7, white has a very aggressive way of playing. d4, e takes d4. And now, instead of simply recapturing with the knight, white sacrifices a second pawn, c3. In this position, actually, the preferred move is knight to a5, attacking this bishop. However, most people will play d takes c3. And now, white has a very aggressive move, giving him the advantage. In fact, some people who have the black pieces cannot find a defense after the following move, and they simply give up. And that move is queen to d5. And the queen and bishop form a battery against that weak f7 square. And there are many games, even between good players, where black has given up in this position, seeing no defense to mate. However, there's quite a nice defense for black, and although he remains in a worse position, he can fight on. How would you stop mate? It's not easy, but black has to play knight h6. And now, the players who did not play knight h6, who simply gave up, they knew white just takes the knight, and the mate threat is renewed, and we've just lost a knight. Now, we must once again stop mate, the simplest way we know how. We castle. And now, black is behind a piece. However, he's threatening the bishop, as well as taking on b2. Probably white's best move here is knight takes c3, g takes h6, and white has a very nice dominating position, and black's king is somewhat exposed. However, black is a pawn ahead. Do you see another move white can make to save this pawn and save his bishop? It's a very strange retreating move, but it does the job. Bishop c1. And now, not only is black a piece down, it looks like he has no compensation. However, not all is lost. Knight b4, attacking the queen, also threatening knight c2 check, forking the king and rook. How can white prevent the attack on his queen, at the same time prevent knight c2 check? Well, he has one way of doing it. Queen d1. Again, black is down his knight, lost his knight, and what is he to do? Well, luckily in this position we have a fork, one of our favorite tactics. Pawn to c2, forking the queen and the knight. So this position was filled with tactics, and in fact, many years ago, when I was a scholastic player just like yourself, I had the following position after queen d5, and my opponent did indeed resign the game. He didn't see he could play knight h6 followed by castles. And although black does have a worse position, resigning and giving up is out of the question. But if you don't see the way to defend mate, then normally you'll just get checkmated. That was pretty disastrous for black, losing and not looking for the best defense. What did we learn from this? When your opponent makes aggressive queen moves, which are very common in scholastic chess, try to find the best defense, no matter how long it takes you. Sometimes you have to think a minute, 2 minutes, or more each move so you can find the best defense. Giving up is no defense, so fight on and never resign. Now, I'd like to talk about some queen pawn openings, two in particular. My favorite, especially when I was a scholastic player, is called the Albin Counter-Gambit. Why is it called a counter-gambit? Well, a gambit is normally initiated by one side, and the opposing side can not only decline to accept this gambit, he can give a gambit of his own. That's what a counter-gambit is. In this example, white's playing the queen's gambit, which we've seen previously. In the game that I lost, which we looked at a few examples ago, I played the Chagorian defense with knight c6. Here, black can also play the Albin counter-gambit, sacrificing a pawn. And the purpose behind this move is so that black can advance his pawn and make it very difficult for white to develop his pieces. In this position, Grandmaster theory recommends that white play knight to f3, developing his knight and attacking the weak d pawn. However, many players make the error pawn to e3, a bad tactical move, trying to immediately remove the pawn. Let's see what happens. Does black take the pawn and simply trade off? That's what white wants. Instead, black gives this very powerful check. So powerful, I once had an opponent play king to e2 to escape this check. And moving your king in the opening before all of your other pieces is not one of your primary goals. Needless to say, I won that game. Most players play bishop to d2, attacking the bishop on b4. Well, this is a tactics video. If black was simply exchanging all the pieces off, that would just be good for white. White would be a pawn ahead, and he would get the trades that he wants. Instead, black sacrifices a piece with pawn takes pawn. The best move for white is simply to recapture, after which he has quite a bad pawn structure. And the move that we'll look at in our example is bishop takes bishop, accepting the piece sacrifice. However, after the better pawn takes pawn, black gets an advantage anyway. Queen h4 check. Notice how the king diagonal is open. g3. And now queen e4, attacking the rook, attacking the e5 pawn, and perhaps most important, attacking the e3 pawn, because we get to learn another example of a pin. Here the bishop is pinning the bishop against the king. The bishop is not allowed to capture the queen. Well, with so many pieces and pawns attacked, white's position is quite bad. In any case, most players with white figure a bishop is a bishop. I'll take that. And black plays pawn takes pawn check. And now, most players notice if king takes pawn, black plays queen takes queen and is a queen ahead. But white can simply play king to e2. And now, this is one of my favorite positions in chess. It's a really nice tactical position. Here, if we play bishop g4 check to attack the king and the queen, white has a brilliant saving move. Can you find it? That saving move is knight f3. Now, not only do you not win the queen, you don't even get to win the knight on g1. And white would be a piece ahead and should win the game. We could also play pawn takes knight and make a queen, as you can do when your pawn gets to the back row. However, white can trade queens and then take the black queen on g1. And strangely enough, we have a position with equal material. Both sides have 3 minor pieces and 2 rooks, and both sides have 6 pawns. So a nice equal position. But black wants more. And how can we achieve this? Well, there's a brilliant move I've had the fortunate opportunity to play several times, and that's pawn takes knight, but we don't make a queen. If we make a queen, white will play queen takes queen check. Instead, we make a knight. Why are we making a knight? Because if we make a knight, it's check, and white cannot play queen takes queen. And if white escapes check with rook takes knight, now bishop g4, which failed miserably to knight f3, no longer fails because there is no knight on g1, and this simply wins the queen. After making a knight with check, white only has one move to save his queen. He must move his king back to e1. Now we have a very strange position. Black has 3 knights on the board. Very unusual. Again, black plays queen h4 check, and if g3, queen check, winning the rook, as in our first example. After queen h4 check, king d2 is forced. And white has a losing position because his king is exposed and he's down a piece. And I've won this position many times. And this is called the Albin Counter-Gambit, and this is a very well-known trap which was first played in the late 1800s, very long ago. And that is why grandmasters don't play pawn to e3. In the Albin Counter-Gambit, they play knight to f3 and don't allow this pawn to come all the way down here and make a knight. A brutal finish. Wow, that was exciting. And under promotion with check, all ending up in winning a piece or possibly winning the queen. What do we learn from this? Well, sometimes even unexpected moves can change the course of the game. So don't just make the obvious move each time. Look for those extra strong unexpected moves, and you too will win a lot of chess games. Now let's go to our last example before I go to the games. And this has to do with another example of a pseudo-pin. d4, d5, the Queen's Gambit again. This is called the Queen's Gambit declined. Knight c3, knight f6. And now we get an example of a pin, bishop to g5, pinning the black knight to the black queen. Very ominous for black. Black has many moves in this position. Today we're going to look at knight b to d7. And now it looks like, at first glance, this move is an error because c takes d5, e takes d5, and now, because the knight is pinned, white can play knight takes d5, winning a pawn. Black dare not play knight takes knight, otherwise he may lose his queen. However, in this situation, the trap E is the one setting the trap. And in fact, this pin is one of those pseudo-pins where the pin doesn't really exist. And Black has a trick which will win him the game. Do you see what Black can do here to take advantage of the pseudo-pin? It's not easy. Yes, he can play knight takes knight, giving away his queen. And now for the brilliant finishing move, bishop b4 check. And all of a sudden, White has severe problems on his king. He must play queen d2 to stop check, losing his queen back, losing his bishop on d8, and Black comes out one piece ahead for one pawn. Black has an extra knight and wins the game. And this is a very famous trap where it looks like somebody's getting pinned, but in actual fact, once they execute their pinning move, they get in some trouble of their own. How did this happen? Because White did not calculate far enough ahead. When you leave a knight attacked on d5 in the middle of the board, assuming your opponent cannot capture it, you better double check your analysis, because after you capture your opponent's queen, Black gets to move after that, and luckily for Black, he gets to win White's queen. Therefore, in this position, grandmasters wouldn't make such a blunder. They would simply play e3 and get ready to develop their other minor pieces, and we have a normal chess game. Boy, that was very complicated. I would say that was the most complicated position in our video. What happened there? It looked like White was all set to win a pawn based on a pinned knight, but the knight wasn't pinned after all. Boy, a lot of tactics, a lot of calculation. It takes a lot of hard work to get good at tactics at chess. So you too have to work hard, and if you calculate just a few moves ahead, you can win at chess games, you can calculate further than your opponent, and you too could be a successful chess player, maybe someday a grandmaster. Now that we've looked at the chess tactics, let's look at our final great game, which is coming up next. Now, for a special treat, I'd like to show you kids at home and in the schools my favorite game of all time. Unfortunately, not played by me, but it was played by my favorite player, the American World Chess Champion Paul Morphy, who was the best player in the world in the middle 1800s, 150 years ago. His games were so wonderful that even today we remember them and we analyze them. And this game was very special. Not only did he win in brilliant tactical fashion, but he won against two players who were consulting during the game. It wasn't cheating. They just weren't world-class players, and they decided they would discuss their moves ahead of time before they made them. Then they thought they would have a chance against the American world champion. They were sadly mistaken. Morphy was white in this game, and Black was Count Isouard and the Duke of Brunswick, a count and a duke, but no match for the American world champion. This game started the way most of our games have, e4, e5. And now they played the Philidor defense, which we saw in a previous example. Here, Morphy played d4, an excellent move, and the count and the duke tried to pin the knight, bishop to g4. Again, this is a pseudo-pin, because after d takes e5, if Black recaptures, instead of capturing the pawn on e5, White trades queens. Queen takes queen, king takes queen, and now there's no more pin, and White just wins a pawn. Not only does White win a pawn, he attacks the bishop and the pawn, forking Black's pieces. Therefore, after d takes e5, instead of recapturing and going into that losing variation, Black simply took the knight. White recaptured. Black recaptured on e5, thereby achieving material equality. And White played bishop c4. Now, if you remember from our first 2 or 3 examples of the video, the queen and the bishop attacking f7. However, unlike those examples, White has 2 pieces developed and Black has 0, because the count and the duke, after playing bishop g4, simply traded away their bishop. Not a well-played opening. Well, of course, they saw their pawn was attacked, and they played knight f6, a move that I recommended in a similar position, blocking White's queen. Here, Morphy found a brilliant fork, forking 2 of Black's weak points. One weak point we've already discussed. the pawn on f7. The bishop attacks the pawn. White wants to continue to attack that pawn. However, in this particular position, we have another weak point. Why would that be? Well, the bishop moved away, leaving the b7 pawn unprotected. Because of these ideas, f7 and b7, both being white squares, white played queen b3, simultaneously attacking this pawn and attacking the b pawn. Black has no way to defend them both. Now, I've lectured on this game many times, being my favorite game, and in fact, I've had this position myself. One time, I was playing several people at once, called the simultaneous exhibition. Maybe you've played in one. And my opponent played b6, noticing that his pawn was attacked. He was beaten very quickly. Bishop takes pawn check, the weak point which he missed, and then queen e6, checkmate. So I won much more quickly than Morphy did because I was only playing one player, not two. Two heads are better than one, at least they usually are. And they realized this pawn was much more important, and they played queen e7. In fact, this is a brilliant tactical move because after queen takes b7, it looks like this rook is certainly lost. But black has a saving move. Can you find that saving move for black? Yes, this one was difficult. The answer is queen b4 check, also attacking the queen. White would be forced to trade queens. Bobby Fischer once said, "I didn't win brilliancy prizes by winning a lot of endgames." So Morphy, playing chess over 100 years before Fischer did, felt the same way, didn't want to take this pawn and try to win the endgame. Instead, he played knight c3, stopping this check, developing his knight, and getting ready for a massive attack. And now it's imperative black defends the b7 pawn. He found a very good way, or they found a good way, c6, the queen protecting b7. And now white played bishop g5. Notice how all of white's pieces are developed. However, black has a queen developed, blocking his bishop, as well as a knight developed, but it's pinned. So not good development for black. When you're lagging in development and your king is in the center and you need to get your pieces out, you must somehow find the quickest way to develop your pieces. Is that what black did here? Unfortunately not. Fortunate for us, because we get to see a brilliant finish. Unfortunate for black, because they lost the game. Instead of developing, they played the aggressive move b5. And as I would say, a very suspicious move. And expecting Morphy to retreat his bishop. Was Morphy the greatest player of all time because he retreated a lot? Probably not. Instead, he sacrificed his knight. Why did he do that? Because after c takes b5, bishop takes b5 check, black's king comes under massive attack. How did he prevent such an attack? Well, he blocked with his knight. And now this knight is pinned to the queen, and this knight is pinned to the king. And white played the brilliant attacking move, a move you normally do not associate with attacking. He castled. Long castle, queenside, and now he has his rook bearing down on the knight. How does black protect himself? Well, black could also castle queenside. However, there's no safety, there's no pawns in front of his king, so bishop a6 check and queen b7 mate would end the game quickly. Instead of castling, black played a better move, rook to d8. And now, black is pretty well defended, and white has almost all of his pieces attacking, but, as is well known in the attacking rules, we must use all of our pieces when attacking. Don't just move your queen every move, get all of your pieces involved. If you look at these pieces, the big guys, which one is not attacking at all, isn't doing anything? That's right, the rook on h1. The rook on h1 must get involved. The slow way to do this would be to move this rook up 1 or 2 squares, and then slide this rook over the following move. However, Morphy was quicker than that. He took the knight, sacrificing another rook. Now, black has a problem. If he takes with the queen, he would lose his queen. If he takes with a knight, he would also lose his queen. So he must take with the rook. And now Morphy gets his last piece into the game, rook d1. And there's no defense to d7. None of the remaining black pieces can defend the rook. Well, when you're getting checkmated and your king is under attack, a good idea is to trade queens. Queen e6. With the queens off the board, the count and the duke assumed they would not get checkmated. Do you think Morphy traded queens? I don't think so. He played bishop takes rook check. Again, if we take with the queen, it would simply be attacked. So we took with the knight. And now Morphy played one of the most famous checkmates in chess history. It's a checkmate in 2 moves. It's white to play. Do you think you could find white's checkmate? Let's have a look. Boy, it's hard to find even a check. But there is one check. It looks crazy, but let's try it. Queen b8 check. This is an easy move to analyze because black only has one legal move. Knight takes queen. And now, with the knight out of our way, Morphy played rook d8 checkmate. So what do we learn from that game? Well, we learned development is important. Black never moved these pieces, and in fact, undeveloped his knight in the final position. And we learned castling is important. Black never castled, white castled early. And probably most important, we learned using all of our pieces to attack. With tactics like pins and forks and using all of our pieces to attack, your tactics will be better than they were before, and you'll win more chess games. You'll be a successful tournament player if you use the tactics in this video properly. That was the last game in our video. Paul Morphy, one of the greatest players of all time, of course won the game. It shows 2 heads aren't necessarily better than 1. It also shows many games in the 19th century, played over 150 years ago, had lots of exciting and swashbuckling tactics. That was the flavor of the day. Most games at the Grandmaster level don't have so much flair, and mainly that's in the analysis. But you too can play exciting chess. Now that you've seen the video, at some point in the near future, you should watch it again and relearn the tactics so that you don't forget. And always make sure to see your tactics, win your chess games, and most of all, have fun while you're playing. Goodbye, everybody.